Right, okay, folks. Welcome back. Welcome back to the podcast. I think it's been a while again since we've done a video episode, and I think I'd be remiss if I didn't just make note straight away of this monstrosity behind me. If you're just listening to the podcast on audio, lucky you. If you're watching on video, I'm afraid I've got a big, tacky Christmas tree behind me already. It's not even December. That's my girlfriend's fault. I shouldn't have called it tacky. I'm going to get myself in trouble now later, but I'm just apologising in advance to the people watching this on video. Anyway, so today's episode, we are going to be, what's the expression? Today's episode, we're going to be kicking the shit out of psychology and psychotherapy a little bit more. We've done it twice before. So on, I think it was episode 65, spoke to Scott Lilienfeld, Science and Snake Oil, I think we called it. And we basically spoke about the problem of pseudoscience in the realm of psychology. And then in episode 56, spoke to a guy called William Epstein. And that was, I'd say the theme of that episode was mainly, well, what I took away from it was a sort of a misguidedness in the research that goes on in psychology and that backs up psychotherapy. But with my guest today, we're going to go that one step further and speak about outright lies and corruption within psychology. So my guest today is Dr. Tomasz Witkowski. Tom is a psychologist, skeptic, and science writer who specialises in debunking pseudoscience in the fields of psychology, psychotherapy, and diagnostics. He is the founder of the Polish Skeptics Club, a non-profit, non-governmental organisation actively engaged in the promotion of critical thinking, scientific skepticism, and scientific methods. And in 2010, he was the recipient of the Rationalist of the Year award from the Polish Society of Rationalists. As well as running his own Forbidden Psychology blog and making regular contributions to the British Psychological Society's Research Digest, that's a mouthful, Tom has authored 200 popular science pieces, 40 scientific articles and over a dozen books, including the two which form the basis of today's discussion, parts 1 and 2 of a proposed trilogy, Psychology Gone Wrong, The Dark Sides of Science and Therapy, and Psychology Led Astray, Cargo Cult in Science and Therapy. Tom, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Good evening.
Okay, before we jump in, Tom, I'm going to say, I've never said this about a book before. Now, Psychology Gone Wrong, the first book, I genuinely mean this, I think it's a masterpiece. It's one of the best books I've ever read in the realm of psychology. I've never said that to any of my guests before because I wouldn't have been telling the truth. I've read some great books by great people, but that book in particular was like a kick in the teeth in the best possible way. So, I mean, I know I'm not any sort of psychology guru or anything, and I know it's only small praise, but I have to say to anybody listening to this, I highly, highly recommend that book. Psychology Led Astray, the second book, I've got to admit, I haven't read that one all the way through. And one of the reasons for that, Tom, is even though I'm skeptically minded, I've become more skeptically minded the longer I've done this podcast, I find this material really sort of hard to digest. I find myself a lot, I'm reading a page, a few passages, and then having to go, hang on a minute, I need to go through that again. And I'm just wondering if do you think is that a common experience for people that come to your material to be so sort of entrenched in the status quo that to read anything different just won't sink in?
Thank you for so many warm words about my books. I think the experiences of people, of readers of my books, are quite different. I mean, some of them are shocked but many of them try to defense the picture of psychology, and they don't agree with me. They used to say I'm exaggerating. I'm cherry picking, using my examples, and so on, so on. So it's not so easy. Of course, I have some readers which have similar thoughts about my books to your thoughts, to your impressions, but they are not common.
Yeah, it is. It is very much an experience reading it, and I thought I was sort of past that now. I mean, it's all the way in back. It's been over a year now since I first interviewed a clinical psychologist called Lucy Johnston. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, and she's sort of she's leading this move away from the diagnostic model of psychology and mental health. And it was interviewing her that sent me off on a completely different tangent to where I was going. And I thought I wasn't sort of surprisable anymore, if that's a word. But yeah, reading some of your stuff has still managed to do that. So anyway, my first question, I guess, before we get into the weeds with this stuff is, I'm always interested in people that have got that more critical view of psychology. I'm interested in how you got there, what your trajectory is in that sense. Did you start out as somebody that was, into into the status quo in the first place, or have you always been skeptically minded and that was your starting point?
Well, I must go back as deep in the history of my life as secondary school. I was in a very good secondary school, and I was educated scientifically in my secondary school. I was taught what is experiment, what is single-blinded experiment, double-blinded experiment, what's randomization, and so on, so on. I was interested more in biology, natural sciences. And I knew quite a lot about methodology. When I started my psychological studies, I was really surprised, because everybody presented me different theories. Let's say there is a personality, and during seminars, teachers told me, okay, this theory of personality talks about this, and this theory is different. And I used to ask, which one is true? And they said, oh, well, you must read, you must compare, you must think, and you have to choose. And I said, it can't be science, because in science, like in biology or like in physics, you have usually one theory which is more or less true. And if another theory is more true, it's better than the other one, it replaces the old one. And most scientists use only one theory, not like in psychology that we have at the same time so many different theories. So the study of psychology was somehow disappointing for me. But okay, I started my practice as an academic, but I also was a psychologist, educational psychologist as well. And I started to use all these tools. And I started to realize that not everything is okay with these tools, and I used pseudo-scientific tools because they taught me them during my studies, and they still do it. And it was just my my activity. I wanted to clean psychology a little bit for myself. So I started to look for things which are not completely true, which are a little bit pseudoscientific, and I realized that I have so much material that it is much more even for one book. But this is a material for 3 books, at least for 3 books. So already I finished, because these 2 books is a kind of trilogy. So these are first 2 volumes, and I have already finished the 3rd volume, but in Polish, not in English yet. And I realized that there is so much pseudoscience in psychology. So many false results, uncertain results, but we must do something with psychology to be reliable for people. As a psychologist, as academics, we should clean our field, and this was the reason why I started to do it.
Yeah, So I read an interview with you that you did with the Psychologist blog. I think this is another British Psychological Society blog, and in there you said that part of the inspiration for starting to write these books, you said that uppermost in my mind were negative emotions, anger and a rejection of injustice, and only later came compassion for all those who had been damaged by dishonest psychologists and psychotherapists. So I'm just wondering, what was the anger driven by from your perspective? Because I mean, when in the telling of that story of your shift into this, it's quite a dry telling, but that quote there speaks to quite an emotional response that you were having as an academic psychologist. So I'm just wondering what sparked the anger and what was the driving force behind it?
When I started to talk loudly about problems of psychology, to speak about it publicly, many people wrote to me, and I met many people who think about themselves as about victims of psychologists and victims of psychotherapists. And it's quite a huge number. It's not just 5 or 6. It's dozens of such people, and they still write to me emails. They write on Facebook. They try to contact me, to meet me, to tell about their stories, and they are really, really victims. And there are several groups of victims. One of them are people who are diagnosed in the situation of for the court, when you are accused about some crime and so on. Quite often you are diagnosed by psychologists, and this psychologists use for diagnose of these people sometimes is really a sorcery. Especially using this ink blood test by Rorschach and projective tests. It's completely useless from scientific point of view, but it is still used in the forensic settings. And I'm not able to say that these people were not guilty or something like this, but I'm sure that this psychologist who diagnosed them, they had no tools to say what they said. And in this way, They are really victims of psychologists. Another group is a group of patients of psychotherapists. And this is quite a big group as well, because psychotherapy works somehow in such a tricky way. You know, when everything is fine, this is a result of psychotherapy and of efforts of psychotherapists. When something is wrong, this is a question of your motivation or the lack of your motivation, or they just say you are not ready to take from psychotherapy the best, you know. So this asymmetry is really frustrating for patients, and it's really striking. And I don't tell you about just that people were not happy because of they talks with therapists, but I'm talking about people who tried to commit suicide as a result of psychotherapy. I say about people who were addicted to alcohol during therapy because it was so bad for them. So I'm talking about real victims. And when you are facing such problems, you are going to be more and more angry. And I feel a little bit responsible for this because I'm a psychologist. I represent this profession. And I would never be reliable as a psychologist if as long as other psychologists will do such bad things, you know?
Yeah. So, okay, Tom. I mean, we're going to dig into this now and sort of fatten it all out a little bit, flesh it out a little bit. So the way I was thinking of doing this was this between the two books I've looked at so far. It's there's so much material in there. There's so many different angles that we could come at this from. So what I'm going to try and do is, with the time we've got, I'm just going to try and squeeze in some discussions about the chapters that were most sort of hard hitting to me. And so the first one was this idea of psychology as a cargo cult science. Now we're going to have to start right back from scratch with this because, you know, a lot of people aren't even going to have heard of cargo cults. I hadn't heard of cargo cults before. So before we explain how that connects to psychology, could you explain what a cargo cult is? First of all, define that for us.
Yeah, it's a very interesting phenomenon, and we have to go back in the history to the, let's say, the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, when whites came to the islands of the Pacific Ocean, and they were observed by islanders. And for them, it was a kind of culture shock because they observed what they did, and it didn't remind them of anything what they knew from their everyday life. And as the result of the activity of whites, usually white soldiers, they saw planes coming from the sky to the land. They saw a lot of boxes labeled cargo with all kinds of goods, and they came to a logical conclusion. In my opinion, it was quite logical that all these planes and boxes are sent by gods. So they started to observe what whites did, and they started to do similar things. So they built runways in the middle of the jungle. They light fires on these runways. They they built radio stations from cane, from wood. They imitated all activity which they observed and about which they thought it's connected and is necessary to bring these cargo boxes to them. And this is very interesting, and this cargo cult is still on some of the Pacific Ocean, and it developed on about 80 islands of Pacific Ocean independently. But the problem is that everything what they did was only an imitation. So no one radio station made from wood and cane wouldn't be able to send any message, and with other facilities they didn't work. They just didn't work. Maybe several times during the Second World War and during very bad visibility, some planes tried to land on these runways. They always crashed. So in several cases, they were really effective. But in most of cases, they were ineffective. And how this cargo cult came to psychology. It is because of the lecture given by Richard Feynman, a famous physicist and Nobel Prize winner. He gave a lecture in 1974 entitled Cargo Cult Science. And he compared social sciences and also psychology to cargo cult. He said that some scientists imitate science in a similar way as the islanders imitate white soldiers, but they have no results. It's ineffective in the same way as all this activity of islanders are ineffective in bringing planes to the runways.
Okay, and so what would be an example of that in action? Because, like we sort of spoke about at the beginning, people get very defensive about this topic, and I've raised the question of whether or not psychology is a legitimate science with a few people, and there's been various answers. There's been sort of some sort of semantic dancing around the idea. There's some that believe in the methodology of like double-blind, placebo-controlled trials and things like that, and say that it is a science. So what is the argument for saying that psychology, either as a whole or in part, is a cargo cult science?
I will give you a very fresh example. 2 years ago, it was in November, if I remember well, a very big meta-analysis of predictors of suicide was published. And we must say that suicide is one of the biggest social problems and is a problem of psychology as well. We can imagine that many people die because of suicide. And the authors analyzed researchers from research from 50 years. They included in the analysis 365 studies. And what they found that we have predictors of suicide as strong as the coin flip. So after 50 years of research, after almost 400 research studies, we know nothing about predicting suicide. And now we should ask what all these authors of this almost 400 studies did during this 50 years. Did they do real science, or did they only imitate science? So what is the result of their research? They have doctoral degrees, they have a lot of publications, they get research grants, they spend a lot of money on research, and they, they were busy for 50 years.
I suppose one of the arguments might be that people that study suicide in suicide research would be that even though we haven't got any better at predicting who is going to commit suicide or when or why, that research has borne fruit in the sense that maybe we understand the process that precedes suicide a bit better. And would that not count for anything?
I agree that we should research and we should try to find everything about suicide and so on. But if we do something for 50 years without any results, we should one day say, okay, we do something wrong, and we should start to looking for a better ways of finding solutions. Otherwise, we are as busy as all these islanders on the runways. We do something, but we really don't understand. And what is interesting, last years, there is a team in United States. They worked with artificial intelligence algorithm. This research was supported by US Army, and this algorithm was able to obtain over 80% reliability in predicting suicides after 2 years. So this artificial intelligence algorithm did much more during 2 years than all these researchers during 50 years. So there are some paths which can bring better results. But quite often we don't do this. We decide to do what we did for last 50 years.
Do you think that that's necessarily a case of that it's the result of a bad application of science, or could it be that the science is being applied in the right way, but it's just that the complexity of the human mind and of human behavior is sort of beyond what we can study properly at the moment, if that makes sense?
The complexity of human mind is a very common excuse.
Okay.
It's a very common excuse, and most research you can read now, they usually take one or two or three factors, and they examine only this separated, isolated factors. And we do it for years. We have now tools to examine complexity. Artificial intelligence is a perfect tool. And there are some researchers who try to deal with complexity. But when you are a researcher, you have to publish. Publish or perish is very, very true now. And it's much easier to do research and to find unimportant results just by isolating one or two or three factors than by doing research on the complexity of human mind. So this is a problem. What scientists do, not this problem is not outside complexity. Human minds is really the most complex system in our universe. And this is true, but it's not true that we don't have tools to test it, to try to explore it. We have them, but we choose another way of research.
One of the more sort of shocking conclusions, I guess, from reading your book is that, like, we've just spoken about suicide there, and so my understanding of it is that, like you just said, despite all the research, suicide rates have been pretty much stagnant since we started recording it. I mean, there's been a bit of up and down, but it's been pretty consistent all along the way. A more interesting statistic, a general statistic, is that with more mental health research, more psychotherapists, more psychology, the mental health statistics are getting worse and worse. So on the one hand, with suicide, it's staying pretty much the same. But with things like depression, anxiety, all those things, that the more psychotherapists there are, the more people there are contributing to this, the worse the problems are getting. So that's not cargo cult science where it's ineffective. That's sort of actively damaging. But firstly, I just want to check with you that that's actually the case, that there's of that paradoxical statistic that the more mental health research, more mental health researchers, things are getting worse. And then if that is the case, what's the explanation for that?
Yeah, first of all, we cannot treat mental health statistics similarly to any other objective measures like temperature or like weight and so on, because no mental disorder now can be identified with biological markers. No even one. We diagnose them based only what people say, and sometimes what people do, but more often what people say. So we can objectively say about the epidemic of flu, but not about the epidemic of mental disorders like depression and so on. And these high numbers, even huge numbers, could be interpreted in several ways. One hypothesis is that this is a result of marketing efforts. We have more psychologists, we have more psychiatrists, we have more psychotherapists, and they try to create needs for their services. They are looking for jobs. So they try to convince us that there is something wrong with our mental health. And we quite often we agree with them. Okay, there's something wrong with me, and this could be this is one of the explanations. Another one could be that this alleged epidemic is a result of fashion. We have more time, we have more money, so we can afford to be mentally ill. I give you an example from 19th century. At the beginning of 19th century, almost half of all European women were diagnosed with hysteria. Have you ever met anybody with a diagnosis of hysteria in your life?
No, it's fallen out of fashion.
Yeah, this is out of fashion. this disappeared. This diagnosis disappeared. Now everybody is ill because of depression, not hysteria. It's quite different. It's a quite different illness. What happened? That 1/3 of all people in Europe, 1/4, sorry, because half of women in Europe is 1/4 of the whole population almost, was ill, and something happened. I don't know what. There was no any drug discovered, nothing. And today we are depressed. Everybody is depressed. So we should think about this explanation. I don't want to convince you that this is the only explanation, but it is one of the explanations, and probably they interact. So on one hand we have fashion, on the other hand we have some marketing efforts, and also probably some people are really mentally ill, but all this causes are mixed, and we have completely unclear picture of mental illness, and some illnesses are probably invented. I can give you an example. One of the most famous psychologists, child psychologist, Jeremy Kagan, told that ADHD is an invented illness. It's not a real illness. And he's an absolute expert in child psychology. So if we will take together all these causes, and we will see a really unclear picture of mental illnesses nowadays. It's not a real picture.
What would be, you see, I can imagine that people hearing this first idea of psychotherapists and researchers in the field are sort of engaged in this, they are perpetuating the situation in order to benefit from it, to profit from it. They need an industry there. If your skill is helping people that are suffering, you need people that are suffering.
Yeah.
And so I can imagine that this accusation that they're sort of actively engaged in creating the suffering that they need to treat, I can imagine people sort of taking umbrage to that on an individual or personal level and saying, well, that's a disgusting accusation. I don't care about profit or wages. I got into this because I care about people and I want to help people. Now, luckily, we haven't got anyone in the room going crazy at the moment saying that. But with that argument in the abstract, how do you deal with that argument?
You mean that with this argument that they want to help people with suffering? You mean this? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering if the idea that these people are helping, even though they claim to want to help people, they are actually part of the problem. They're creating the parameters and the diagnoses in order to say that, well, you're suffering, so you need my help. Their defense of that would be, I'm just trying to help people. And I'm wondering, is it an unconscious process that they're engaged in, or are we veering more towards they actively know what they're doing and they're doing it on purpose?
Both. I think many psychotherapists, they believe they help people. They believe they are effective. And in this way, they are not, they don't cheat people. But quite often they are ignorance, because they don't study research results, or they interpret research results in accordance to what they think about psychotherapy, and this is a problem. So I don't want to say they are bad people. They try to cheat us and to earn our money, and they try to convince us that we are mentally ill and just to take our money. Maybe some of them, not many. Most of them believe they help people, they are honest people, and so on. And many students, because I taught students at the beginning of their career, and most of them wanted to help other people. It was the main motivation, and yeah, I think it looks like this.
Okay, now to be fair, what I took away from this, and I've read in a couple of places, that you've actually said that when it comes to, see, when we're talking about these therapies, we're talking about a very broad base of therapies. So everything from, I don't know, sort of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy up to, dog therapy and playing in the sand therapy and things like that. But you yourself have said that of all the therapies, that CBT actually has a fairly solid scientific basis to it. I don't want to misquote you. Is that the case?
Yeah, we of course, when we are talking about psychotherapy, we put now, according to a new paper published by Scott Lilienfeld, is over 600 therapeutic modalities now. So it's really huge number. And we are talking on blog about all of them. So it's of course not fair. Some of them are so-called evidence-based therapies, and CBT is really, or was, I would say today, was evidence-based, because since I published my books, many new studies were published, and we see something what is called in psychology decline effect. Decline effect means that at the beginning, when you discover something, or when you start to research something, there is quite clear results about it. And with time, the results are lower and lower. And we observe now this effect with CBT. The explanation for this is that when new therapy comes on the market, everybody is excited because this is new, this is well proved. So this is a hope. If patients, when patients have a lot of hope, the therapy works. Now CBT is something like everyday life. It's not exciting anymore. It's not new, and it doesn't work as strong and as the beginning when they started to do therapy based on CBT. So it's changing with therapies. There are some studies showing that when there is a film about psychotherapy, famous film, and in this film a person, let's say, is going to psychoanalytic, and during the psychoanalysis there is a catharsis moment, and so on. and people watch this film and they know how it works. And in such case, when many people see the story in the movie, they start to behave during psychotherapy in a similar way as the people in the movie, because it's a kind of modeling of behavior. So they know that this catharsis moment will come, they expect it, and the therapist is expecting it, and it comes somehow,
Like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, exactly.
Another one of the interesting ones that I ran into when I spoke to William Epstein was that CBT is equally effective whether it's given by a complete amateur or somebody who's like a hardened 20-year professional. The results, the outcomes are exactly the same.
And sometimes it's even better when you examine laymen and therapists. Sometimes they obtain higher results than therapists.
Sorry, Tom. What's the explanation for that? I mean, how does that work?
The main explanation is that the relationship between patient and therapist is much more important than all this theoretical background which we suppose work during psychotherapy. So if someone is empathic and nice to you and is listening to you and so on, so it's very effective. But it's not a case in all studies. It's not true that all studies will show you the same result and that we can say all therapists are worse than laymen. It's not really true. What we should looking for is. I will give you an example from 60s. In 50s and 60s, people thought psychotherapy is not effective because a comparison of experimental group and experimental psychotherapeutical groups and control groups were in average the same. But when you had a look inside these results, this psychotherapeutic results, you could find very, very good results and very, very bad results. In control group, the results were similar, so in this group treated by psychotherapists, there were people with very, very good results, with very good profits, and people with some harm. And then researchers started to examine these processes more carefully, and now we know that psychotherapy can help you and can hurt you. When you put this into one box, you will get average similar to no psychotherapy, to control group. And these results could be similar with these studies with laymen and with psychotherapists. But some of psychotherapists can reach really, really high results, very, very good results, and some of them very, very bad results. And we should examine these results more carefully.
Right. Okay. I think this would be a good segue into the next topic of interest. It's something that's sort of been coming up in the press a lot at the moment, and it's in your book, chapter 6, it's called The Myth of Replication. So I'm just going to pass that one over to you and let you introduce this topic and just tell people what replication is and why it matters, and then we'll jump into it a bit more from there.
Okay, replication is just a repeating of research of experiments. And why it's important? Because, when I do some research, I can make mistake, or I can cheat you, or I can forget about something, and so on, or maybe some I don't take into account any factors. I don't notice something. When we repeat research, we obtain knowledge about these results, whether they are stable or not stable. If they are stable, that means that I discovered something important. And when we repeat them several times, we can be sure it is really something important in science, in psychology. And replication is important in the whole science. There is no sciences who doesn't do replication. It must be, and this is a difference between knowledge of normal people who cannot replicate their experiences in a systematic way in comparison to science. So we can repeat very, very similarly to other authors the experiments, and we can say whether they were true results or maybe whether there was something wrong. And as you said, the replication in psychology is a kind of myth, because everybody wants to publish something new. Everybody wants to discover something new. Repeating experiments of others is a boring activity. It's also sometimes people watch at you and say, okay, you are checking me whether I'm right or wrong. So we don't like people who try to check whether we did proper experiment.
Well, sorry, Thomas, just to jump in there. So I just want to clarify. So I remember we're talking about the definition of science. So I remember going back all the way to high school. A very basic definition of science was that you are able to, in order to trust the results, you have to be able to repeat them over and over. And so that seems very sort of elementary. It should be what's expected. I mean, it was expected of us in our high school classrooms. I'm wondering how much of repeating studies is standard practice in psychology compared to the other sciences.
I can give you an example from last week. Last week, a big replication project called Many Labs 2 published research results. And about 200 scientists from 60 labs, representing 36 labs from 6 continents, they tried to replicate 28 famous psychological experiments. And they were able to obtain the same results for only half of them. So this gives you an imagination about it. All these 28 experiments they tried to replicate. They are famous experiments. There were talks in TED conference about them. They are in textbooks and so on, so on. But for me, as a critic of science, which relies about all these methodological flaws and so on, this is a very good result. But for psychology, it means that all knowledge, what we have, half of this knowledge is worthless, is completely useless. So take a textbook, psychology textbook, and half of the pages are wrong, and you don't know which half.
So just to clarify then, so the idea of replication, that's not standard procedure for a psychological study. And I'm guessing it's probably got something to do with the logistics of it, because, I mean, I don't know anything about physics or anything, but I'm imagining that when you're shooting a photon through a pane of glass or something, you can do that over and over in a lab fairly quickly, fairly easily with a small team of people. But with psychology, we're talking about probably bigger teams of people and over a longer stretch of time in order to carry out the initial study in the first place. So is that the reason that replication, trying to repeat studies, isn't standard practice?
No, this is not the main reason. It could be one of the reasons, but the main reason is that scientists try to be original. So everybody is interested in publishing new results. Another reason is that replication, it's really hard to publish results of the replication. Many journals don't accept for publication just the replications. There was a funny example in 2011 or 2012. Ben published in Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which is a very high prestigious journal. He published some results about precognition. And precognition was never proved. For science, to prove precognition means a revolution in science, not only in psychology, also in physics and so on, because it means that time is not just linear. And some psychologists from Great Britain, Richard Wiseman and Chris French, among others, they made replications just after publication of this experiment. At once, they did it at once, and they didn't confirm the results of Ben, and they sent their research results to Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and they get answer. We do not publish just replications. We publish only original results, original experiments, So this is a really funny, because when Journal of Personality and Social Psychology publish something, you can't change it, And what Chris French told me, the journals from parapsychology journals, they were prone to publish their results, more prone than psychological journals. And this is a result. This is a cause of the situation that we have so few replications.
Another one that apparently journals aren't interested in publishing is studies with negative results. Now, on the face of it, you can sort of understand why that would be the case, because you know, we do a study based on someone comes up with some random hypothesis, and then they have to do a study to figure out whether the predicted results are going to be the case. And you know, I'm guessing. I mean, in fact, I've looked this up, that some of the shit that people are studying is ridiculous. So I've managed to find these are some titles, Tom, of real studies that got published in various journals. So the International Journal of Neuroscience released a report titled "The Effects of Unilateral Forced Nostril Breathing on Cognition." And so that study was whether breathing through one nostril made you more intelligent than breathing through the other nostril. The Journal of Analytic Psychology published one titled "Farting as a Defense Against Unspeakable Dread." There was one called "Unwanted Intrusive Thoughts and the Growth of Facial Hair, a Cognitive Analysis." So that was about whether having I think it was whether growing hair on like your nose and your ears and unexpected places made you more depressed, and whether shaving it off made you feel better. There's one called "Does Smelling Granny Relieve Depressive Mood? Commentary on Rapid Mood Changes in Human Odours. Neurological and cognitive abnormalities associated with chronic petrol sniffing, and then gender differences in book carrying." So, Jesus, the thing, there's a bit of a paradox there, Tom. In on the one hand, I'm thinking journals are turning this stuff down because it's, especially when you do a study that's got negative results, it's maybe not very interesting. There was a hypothesis, it was proved to be wrong, so what's the point? But then on the other hand, they're doing this nonsense, and so I'm a little confused as to what the motivations are behind some of these journals and behind some of the research that's got, because these have been funded. I'm involved in a study at the moment with a university, and I'm part of the team that are applying for a study grant. So I know what's involved in this and how difficult it is to get funding, and they're getting funding for studying sniffing through different nostrils. And so I'm wondering if you can help me get my head around what's going on with the politics and the motivations behind all this from both the funding side and the journal side of it.
Well, it's it's really funny. We call it junk science. Such studies, strange studies, completely useless sometimes. As you noticed. Sometimes for nothing, just spending money on research. But this is also a result of this politics that we want original results, and also that many scientists want to publish so-called sexy results. When you publish sexy results, many journalists are interested in these results. They will write some notes in the journals. Maybe you will give a speech during TED conference or similar conference, and you will become famous. With just a replication, you will never become famous, or you will never arrest an attention of journalists. And so they try to do such bizarre things just to gain an attention of everybody. But what we know about all these research results, that most of them are never cited even once. What does it mean? Does mean that nobody read it, or someone read it and thought it's not worth citing. It's for nothing in my work. And this is about now. This is about half of all publications are never cited by anybody. So this is junk. This is junk science. But with negative results, it's not so simple. Also, because when you have negative result, it means it can be result of bad procedure, bad design, of bad research, and it's not worth publishing. But some research are well done, very well done, and they obtained bad results, negative results, and they are also not published. And this is completely stupid in the science, because let's talk again about CBT, and let's assume that 10 researchers make research on effectiveness of CBT, and 3 of them get results which show that CBT is effective, and 7 of them get negative results, no effects. So these 3 researchers have much higher probability to be published than these 7 researchers. But the picture of this therapy is false, because on average, this CBT is an example. It's not true. Don't take it as a true. But this research, this published research, show not the whole truth. If we publish only positive results, that means that we will bias our knowledge in the direction that psychotherapy works. Yes. Because all these negative results, not published negative results, will not be taken into account because nobody can read them. They are in the drawers. By the way, we have so-called drawer effect in psychology, not only in psychology, which means that many of our research results are in our drawers because they are negative. They say more or less there is no effectiveness in psychotherapy. They say there is no any relation between one factor and another factor, and so on, and they are not published. So we see this reality not as it is, but only a part of this reality.
I'm just wondering, Tom, whether there's any sort of way around this, because I mean I understand that these journals with certain prestige, and journals are going to get you journals that are recognized within the profession, and the press they get a lot of their stories from what's published in journals. But in the age of the internet now, it's not like anybody can there's a limited amount of pixels that we can use. There's an infinite amount of space to actually get this information out there, and I'm just wondering if there's any sort of concerted effort to be people trying to actually publish this stuff. The journals aren't interested, the papers aren't interested, but maybe researchers will be interested, so up it goes on the internet somewhere. And I'm just wondering if there's any sort of initiative that's trying to do something about this.
Yes, there is an initiative, but there is a problem also with so-called open access journals. So there are many of such journals you can publish in the internet. We call them open access journals. But there is a problem that some of them are so-called predators. What does it mean? That means that they collect money for publishing. So if you want to publish as a researcher, you are sending your article to such journal, you pay, let's say, $100 for a review process, and they earn money on you, you know? And they are called, they are very aggressive sometimes, they are called predators among journals, and many of them are created just for collecting money, for nothing more. Okay, some of them are really prestigious, but there is still hierarchy of these journals, and if you publish in a good journal, you collect more points for the evaluation of your career than if you publish it in such unknown internet journal only. So there is still a war to get place in these high prestigious journals.
God, it's all fame and money. It's no better than Instagram, the psychology industry. Which I suppose now would be a good time to move on to maybe part 3 of this. So we're talking about, you know, psychology as a cargo cult science, and there's maybe some sort of unconscious processes going on there with people's motivations, and then we get into the problem of replication, which is, you know, it's problems to do with funding and prestige and journals and politics. This part, there's no excuse for. And this is about talking about scientific misconduct. So people just falsifying and fabricating data. I'm not really sure where to start with this one, to be honest. These chapters in your book are just mind blowing. So some of the stuff that's in there. I guess let's start with what would be your favorite example, maybe, of a person that fabricated, falsified data, and an example that explains the potential consequences of it as well, of somebody doing this.
I think a historical one is Sir Cyril Bard, because he was the first knighted psychologist on the world. He died in 1971. He was founder of educational psychology, and his topic was intelligence. And 5 years after his death, some researchers discovered strange numbers, strange correlations in his papers. They realized that most of his papers has the same research result, the same correlation, absolutely the same, let's say 0.56, and the 0.56 or 86 was repeated in each his study. They started to examine his work, and they discovered that he even invented his co-authors. So it was Cyril Bard and 2 women, and these women never existed. They were, but they were as authors. We are talking about the world before the internet era, so it was much easier to do such things. But he influenced British educational system. And because of his research results, this system was modified, was shaped in this way that children were given IQ tests when they are 11, and in accordance with the results, were made decisions about their future. So the whole British educational system was shaped by Cyril Bart's research results. And they were fabricated, they were falsified. And many children probably lost their chances for education because of the research, of the results in these IQ tests when they were 11. And now we know that it's the development of intelligence is not quite linear. It's not like that you can say at the age of 11 everything about child, that this is this child can go study mathematics or psychology or something else, and this should be a worker, and so on, so on. So this is, I think, this is a very striking example of such consequences of the falsifying of research results.
Now, the obvious sort of riposte to that would be, okay, fair enough. You've dug into history or whatever, and you've come up with this one bad apple, and the results of it were pretty bad. But surely that's, it must be really rare, like 1 in a million. We're talking that where researchers are doing this kind of thing. Now, of course, I know the answer to this question, but that I'm guessing for a lot of people that would be, that's where the accusation of cherry picking might come in, and that's not representative of at all of the of people that are working in psychological research. So, do you have any tests, any statistics? Sorry, to disprove my 1 in a million statistic that I've just come up with?
First of all, we should say that there is no good results, not reliable data about misconducts. Like we don't have good data about corruption, about sexual abuses, and about crime, and so on. All the data are underreported. This is a first assumption, because people don't want to say, okay, I falsified data, I corrupted some officials, and so on, so on. So we always should say that all the data are a little or more than little underreported. And there was a big meta-analysis in 2009 by Daniel Fanelli, who analyzed many research on investigating the honesty of other scientists, and 2% of all of them admitted to committing the most serious scientific crime. I mean, fabricating data. 2% of them. And in other research study, the authors found 7% of researchers admitting fabricating research results, and even much higher numbers we can see when we are asking about whether you met anyone who fabricated research results. So then people say about 30%, even 30% of scientists who are fabricating research results. So the numbers are really, really huge. And Cyril Barth was very famous psychologist, and it was big scandal when people discovered his frauds. But a few years ago, we had in psychology Dietrich Stapel, and he fabricated research results in over 60 papers. And he's not a very old man. He's not a scientist anymore, but he fabricated research results for over 60 papers. And he was famous. He was in TV. He was explaining some social phenomena. So he fabricated sexy results.
Yeah, the interesting thing about how do you pronounce it, Dietrich Stapel, was I was going to bring this up. We've sort of covered it already, but the sort of, he spoke about the sort of motivations for doing this and the circumstances within which an academic is able to fabricate results. And so I just wonder if you'd sort of elaborate on that a little more, maybe based on what he said, like say his motivations for doing it and why it's so easy to get away with.
Well, he even wrote a book about it, kind of diary. It's a funny story. Okay, we have to take his explanation a little like an excuses, but this is true that he was able to do it because he had no control over him. And there is still no control in science. And in many research projects, researchers are alone with their data. They are sitting at homes in front of their computers, and the temptation is really high. And what we know from psychology, that honesty is a function of the size of temptation. So it's really tempting to fabricate data, and this problem is connected also with so-called raw data, because raw data means all this raw data which we collect in questionnaires, on all these papers, and we publish only the last results. And quite often, this raw data are not available. And scientists struggle against control over raw data. They don't want to send you when you're asking for it.
And so, yeah, when I was reading about this in the book, the immediate thing that comes to mind is, I can't think of any legitimate reason why you produce you do a study, whether it goes well, whether it goes bad, whatever. You've got all this raw data there that maybe somebody else could analyze it and come up with a better result, or not necessarily the result that you want that fits your hypothesis, but that just comes up with that can analyze it maybe better than you, or look at it from a different angle. And I think that's quite an exciting prospect. And you've got all this data there, and you've looked at it through your lens and through the hypothesis that you set forth. But maybe you're not looking at it right, and so share it with the world. Let everybody have at it and see what they can come up with, or just see if it's of any use of any kind to somebody. And to me, that seems like quite a productive and honest and just the right thing to do. Not even necessarily altruistic or morally right or anything. Just I don't know, just sort of exciting from a scientific perspective. So when you've got people that are reluctant to give you access to this data, I immediately think, well, you're bullshitting. There's something not right about that. And so I'm wondering, again, like you said, that the data's probably dodgy on this, but how often would you suspect that the reason somebody isn't willing to provide other scientists with access to their raw data is because they've made shit up and there's something in there that's going to get them caught out?
Well, I did a small research, small experiment. Several years ago, I was sending questions to different researchers, just asking for raw data to send me them, and I get, let's say, about half positive answers. So half of researchers are prone to share their data. And there is initiative now of some researchers. This initiative is signed by about 500 researchers now. The researchers decided that they will not review papers if the author of the paper will not be ready to send them this raw data, or a rational explanation why he or she cannot send them. Because sometimes, there are sensitive data or supported from some grants, and not all data should be available for everybody. But anyway, they decided data or rational explanation. And 2 years ago, there was again kind of scandal, when one of people who signed this initiative asked for such a data. And it was a review for one of American Psychological Association journals. And the editor of this journal asked this reviewer to resign from his position, because he said, we don't have written this. He even didn't send the ask for raw data to the author of this research. He sent proposition to this reviewer to resign from his position, and he pressed him just to give up. No, this is a scientific freedom. I mean, scientists they are really free people. They have no control, because they do things, and layman, general public, cannot evaluate their work, because a general public has no knowledge, no skills to evaluate their work. Only other scientists can evaluate their work, and sometimes it's a really small group of scientists because of specialization, and they protect their freedom. They protect all these aspects of their work, not to share data, not to be under their control.
Right, Tom, just before I'm going to I want to sort of pull this all together with you sort of telling the story about your own, what's it called, a social hoax.
Yeah.
You have to explain what one of them is before we do. But just to sort of emphasise what we've just spoke about then, because I've got the figures here, and just to sort of drive this point home, because it's so bad. So it's from this is from the Danielle Finelli study. It's 2% admitted to the fabrication of data. In the Leslie K. John study, that was 7% of researchers admitted to fabricating data. Back to the Finelli, one, it's 14% personally witnessed such practices amongst other scientists.
Yeah.
Almost 34% pled guilty to other less serious offences, and 72 let me emphasize, 70% had personal evidence of such behaviour in their colleagues. But, and again, bearing all those figures in mind, and like with that 7% figure from the Leslie K. John study, like you've said, that stuff's going to go underreported, because I imagine that people get sent these studies. That 7% is only the 7% of people that are willing to look at a study that says, have you ever fabricated data? And they're ballsy and arrogant enough to go, yes, I have. How many people are going to have looked at that questionnaire and thought, yeah, I'm not answering that honestly. No, I've never done that. And when you think about it from that perspective, it's insane. It's insane. Anyway, so if we could sort of close this up now with your own experiment. So it's you performed a psychological social hoax. A bit of a tongue twister, that. So if you could briefly explain what that is, and then tell us the story of your own version of that.
Okay. Should I explain a Sokal hoax first?
Yes. Yeah, just briefly.
Alan Sokal, he's a physicist and mathematician, and he was angry about using math and physics by postmodernists for explaining strange things like Jacques Lacan and so on. And he wrote an article which was a complete nonsense. It contained many quotations from physicists from quantum physics and from mathematics. And he sent it to Social Texts, if I remember well, to a journal, a flagship journal of postmodernists, and they published it. And he debunked it. He even wrote a small book about it, and he debunked each sentence in this article. And he showed that they use the sentences without understanding it at all. And it was a big scandal about his hoax. And 11 years ago, I decided to repeat a similar hoax, because the reasons why I did it were quite different from Sokal. I didn't want to prove that they publish stupid things from maths and physics. Although I also wrote about quantum physics without understanding it. I wanted to try whether it is okay. I observed practices of editors of journals, of popular psychological journals, and I noticed that they publish many pseudoscientific articles, many pseudoscientific texts. And even if they have a scientific committee, even if among editors there are several doctors, PhD, and I wanted to check whether it is possible to publish complete nonsense in such a journal about psychotherapy. Because, such a journal is a way to minds of potential patients. And I wrote an article under a pseudonym Renata Olanier. I invented non-existent therapy. It was complete nonsense, similarly to Sokal case. I wrote also something about quantum physics, about Jacques Lacan, about morphogenetic fields, which is a known concept from Rupert Sheldrake. He's a pseudo scientist from Great Britain, quite well known in Great Britain, I think. And I sent it to this journal, and I was really surprised because they sent me for the acceptation this article with some changes, and it was bigger than my article, and I realized that the editorial team added some plagiarized texts. They plagiarized some paragraphs from the internet. So they took part in preparing this hoax, and they published it. They published it, and 2 days after publishing, when I saw this in a paper version, I debunked it. I sent a letter to the editors. I debunked it on my blog, and I sent some information to the editorial team, to the scientific committee, explaining what happened. And to my surprise, they never published any text which explained to the readers what really was wrong in my text, And I was really, really surprised 2 years ago because one Australian scientist asked me whether this text from this journal is available anywhere. And I had known this text, and I found that I can buy this issue in the internet. Just as a paper issue. I ordered it and I got it to my home. And I expected that I will find some piece of paper or something like this, that it will be marked, this text, that it's not true or something like this. Nothing. They sell it since 2007. And today you can buy this issue of this magazine with this nonsense inside without any explanation.
Right, just to clarify, Tomasz, was this? I know I've read some papers that are written in the humanities read more like sort of abstract opinion pieces than anything that's claiming any sort of empirical research behind it. The paper that you wrote, did you actually claim that you'd conducted a study with study participants and like a control group, or was it more of an abstract theoretical piece?
I didn't claim that. I only claimed that I took part in research of a French scientist who discovered all these things, and I described all this research. They were completely stupid, completely nonsense, but I described it. So it was not based on my opinions. But it was based on the science. It was some new technology also involved in the process of diagnosis. This technology based on quantum physics. I didn't understood what I wrote really.
The scary thing about that, though, Tom, is that because that had made its way into a journal, you've then got some social proof and some academic legitimacy that's been added to this idea, which you could have then gone out and given it a name and been a practitioner in it and started bringing in money and people that were struggling with depression, whatever, and convince them that, you know, here's this new therapy and here's the proof. It's in this prestigious journal. And that's insane.
And it works because several years after my hoax, I found in the internet that in Germany, someone discovered a very, very similar machine, let's say machine, to diagnose people in this way I described in my hoax article. And it was, the price of this was 500 euro or something like this. So this is reality. It's not just a hoax, because I did a hoax, but many people just do it for money, and they are successful. And this is reality.
One thing that I noticed about this, the experiment that you did. Now I'm a supporter of that sort of move, because I think that anything that, if you've got a journal that's being lazy like that, or anybody that's involved in academia that's being lazy and lax, or that's just sort of trying to profit off it, anything that sort of gives them either a disciplinary slap across the face, or just makes them get their affairs in order and be a bit more strict about the criteria that they use to admit studies to their publication. I'm all for that, but some people aren't. And I believe that there was someone wrote there was a journal article published. There was an article published in a journal based on a criticism of you doing that experiment, and the argument there is, and against that kind of practice in general, is that when you engage in hoaxes like that, you're sort of you're undermining academic psychology, and then that makes it easier for sort of snake oil salesmen and pseudoscientists to prey on vulnerable people. And I'm just wondering what your opinion is of that.
You mean, I don't know whether I understand you well. You mean that such kind of activity like my hoax undermines the scientific psychology, yeah?
Yeah. And then as a result of that, because say people read about a hoax in the paper that, you know, somebody caught this journal out for being lax or lazy or corrupt or whatever, and then the public go, oh my God, well, you know, academics and scientific journals, they're not to be trusted. And then as a result of not trusting academics and these scientific journals, as a result of that, they become more prone or more vulnerable to pseudoscientists as a result of that.
Yeah, it's this accusation in my direction is quite often. I hear it quite often, but I don't agree with this. I mean, when you produce not a good product, not good enough, when you produce a car with some problems with brakes, there is not a solution to not speak about it, but the solution is just to repair it, just to say people, okay, this model of your car is wrong, don't drive it anymore, bring it to us, we did mistake, and we will repair it. Otherwise, some of these people will die, some of these people will be hurt, and we will maintain we are a good producer of cars. It's the same with science. If we do something wrong, we should admit it and we should repair it. We can't hide it, and because you know, it's not a way to obtain credibility.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm like I say, I'm totally in favour of it. I especially, reading people like you and Scott Lilienfeld, William Epstein, um, Tana Deneen as well. Brilliant. Um, it's something's got to be done about it because it doesn't seem to be regulating itself in the. It doesn't seem to be regulating itself without that. Like you said, we've got however many years of research going on, and we're going off in all sorts of random tangents, and the sciences, it seems to be getting more and more lax, and pseudoscience seems to be getting more and more prominent. So, anything that puts academics on edge and makes them feel like they're being watched and makes them more likely to carry out decent research, I'm all for it. It gets my vote anyway. Okay, Tom. So before we close this out and get into the quickfire questions, I guess these sort of two fairly big questions left hanging. The first one would be, how do you think the battle or the war against bad science, how is that going from your perspective? Do you think that you're making progress and that things are getting better, or do you kind of feel like you're just, I don't know, sort of pissing into the wind a little bit?
There is some progress, but this is really, really slow progress. I mean, such projects like many labs too shows that this is a really big progress because so many scientists are engaged in replication. The research are pre-registered, and this becomes to be more and more popular. So there is some progress, but I'm not really sure whether this progress is forced by this power of looking for truth, or is it only an answer to the crisis in psychology? Because we are in crisis, and we should say about it. Many psychologists deny it. They say we are not in a crisis. Even last time, some doctoral students told me during seminars, they said something about crisis, and the professor said to them, "What kind of crisis? What you are talking about? If you are talking about crisis, you don't understand statistics. You don't understand science." So there is slight progress, but there is still this conservative attitude to maintain scientific freedom, and the cost of this scientific freedom is a false science.
And the more, maybe a bigger question, but it's at an individual level and a pragmatic level. I'm always very conscious when I have these conversations, as somebody that was at one point at the lowest of the low and nearly went over the edge. The sort of the vulnerability you feel, especially when you've got no knowledge of psychology and psychotherapy, and you don't know how to critique it, and you see therapists as the people that are going to help you. Like, I can't get myself out of this. I need someone to get me out of this. And when you're in that position of vulnerability, to hear a conversation like this that we're having could be very disheartening or scary even, because it might lead people to think, well, the only thing I had left was that I was hoping that there was someone out there who could help me. But apparently there's this industry out there that's sort of, if it's not predatory, then it's corrupt. And even if it's not corrupt, it's just sort of bordering on the useless as a whole. for those people at an individual level, what are they to do?
It's a really difficult question, because it's a question. An answer to this question is really difficult in an ethical way, because if we want to be if we want to act in accordance with the rule primum non nocere, we should say we don't.
Which is, sorry, Tom, is that the that Latin for do no harm?
Yes, first do not harm. First do not harm. So I should say I don't know. It's a cruel answer. Somehow it's a cruel answer. I realize it, but it should be said like this, because there is another rule, which is melius anceps remedium quam nullum, what means better any cure than no cure. But better any cure than no cure. It was the base for neurosurgeons in the 19th century and the first half of 20th century, and they did many experiments on mentally ill people with surgery, and they discovered lobotomy. And lobotomy is a consequence of this rule: better any cure than no cure. It is really to say, because first do not harm means that if I don't know, if I'm not sure, I shouldn't do anything with any patient. And the patient cries, I need a help, and the family cries, we need a help for our son or father, and so on. And I'm not sure. And to be honest, I should say I can't do anything. I know this is an open gate for charlatans, for all this kind of people who are coming and they say, yes, we can do it. We will deal with this. We will cure this cancer. We will cure this depression, and so on, so on. But science is somehow cruel, because we say there is no hope. As far as we know, there is no hope. As far as we know, there is no cure for this. So I realize that our conversation and this kind of conversation is a little depressive, but we are talking about realistic hopes, not about hopes which cannot be fulfilled.
Yeah, I remember, Tom. It was towards the end of my conversation with William Epstein, and I've had a lot of brilliant conversations doing this podcast, but there are certain watershed moments for me, and one of them was, you might recall because you listened to the conversation. Towards the end, I said to William, "Sorry, William, I know, like, I'm feeling very conscious that we're leaving this on a very negative note, and I was wondering if there's anything positive to take away from this." And he said to me, no, we should be ending on a negative note because that's the way things are. And that's always stuck with me because, in my claim, I want to help people with this podcast. I want to provide people with hope through doing it. But at the same time, even though I'm not a scientist, I'm not an academic, at the end of the day, the truth is what matters the most. And in a sort of counterintuitive way, I sort of feel that even if the truth is harsh and leaves you feeling vulnerable, that's potentially the best position to be in, because I think to be sort of realistically pessimistic is better than false hope, because at least you can, at least you know where you're starting from, and it's an honest position to be in. And I think there's sort of strength in admitting that to yourself, that maybe, you know, things are pretty shit, and, you know, go see a therapist. And like David Smale talks about, I've come round to his way of thinking that a therapist is just sort of a friend. It's human connection, but that you pay for, and that it's only maybe useful to that extent. And I'm all for that. You know, if you're lacking human connection, go out and get that human connection however you can. But I am coming around to believe that it's the harsh truth is the best thing. And once you can admit the harsh truth to yourself, there is something empowering about that. I've not quite managed to come up with what it is that's empowering about it. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, but yeah, that's sort of the way I see it. I wish it had been that way for me. I wasted a lot of time with false hope, and it's that the problem with it is when you latch onto a person or a technique or a 6-week program that you think's going to cure you, and then it doesn't. That just ends up taking you to an even lower place. So yeah, I don't know. It's sort of like, paradoxically, I know it's a depressing note to end on, but maybe it may be an empowering one in a strange way. Like I say, I've not quite put my finger on it yet. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I agree with you, and maybe I can quote words of Hans Eysenck, another British very well-known psychologist, who said once that psychotherapy is a kind of prostitution of friendship. And he didn't want to depreciate psychotherapy. He wanted to underline that this is what therapy really is, that we are coming. He said some men are coming pay for love. They don't want to maintain their wives. They don't want to engage in love affairs and so on. So they prefer to pay for love. And some people have no friends. They don't want to engage in a friendship, or maybe they can't afford friendship, and they can go to psychotherapists just to pay for it. And we should say it's fair, it's okay, but we should call it that this is what we really do is a prostitution of friendship, not any miracle cure which will help you somehow. No, just a relation for which you pay. This is a point of view of very, very famous psychologist Hans Eysenck, and maybe it's an honest way to say so about psychotherapy.
Yeah, I think it's almost inherent in that. There's almost a call to just getting back to sort of basic human values, community values. You know, being more in touch with friends and family, and being a sort of an upstanding member of your community and things like that. And I think that's not advertised really as a solution. It seems to be either psychotherapy and medication or nothing. You're up shit street and you've just got to deal with it. Whereas I think maybe inherent in recognizing the limits of medication and the limits of therapy, but also recognizing what it is about therapy that does work: human connection, being validated, that maybe inherent in that is the call to a third option, and that's to be, just to get more involved with friends, family, community, those sorts of things. Anyway, that's an episode all of its own, Tom. So anyway, let's jump into before we jump into the quickfire questions, because as always, the quickfire questions are just for the people that support the podcast on Patreon. If you'd like to do that, you can do so for as little as $2 a month to gain access to all sorts of exclusive content, newsletters, little blog posts, these quickfire questions, and some Ask Me Anything episodes, things like that. I'm working on more stuff, but there's a few things up there for you to gain access to. Just go to patreon.com/my own worst enemy. And speaking of links, before we jump into that, Tom, have you got any websites, Facebook pages, social media, anywhere you'd like to direct the listeners, the viewers towards? If you take a moment to do that, please.
Yeah, I have an English language blog, and the address is forbiddenpsychology.wordpress.com. So quite easy to remember, and I invite you just visit this blog and comment it.
Okay, well, any are you active on social media at all?
It's Psychology Gone Wrong on a Facebook. It's a fan page of my book, first English language book, Psychology Gone Wrong.
Right, okay. Well, as always, everyone knows I will include all those links in the show notes. I'll dig up whatever I can, anything interesting about Tom and his work, and all that will be available in the show notes. Okay, so let's jump into these quickfire questions now. And as always, you get the first one free. And that is, Tom, what is the last book you read, and then the best book that you've ever read?
Okay, the last one was The Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker. Very, very good book, and a very optimistic one.
Yes, it is, yeah.
In contrary to our conversation. But I really can't say about the best book in my life. There were so many very good books, but it would be unfair to say this one was absolutely the best one. I can't say it.
Okay, then. So you can't say what's the best one in that sense. If you were going to get shipped to a desert island right now and you can just grab one book, what book are you going to grab?
It's really difficult.
Doesn't need to be non-fiction. Doesn't need to be psychology based. Can be anything.
Yeah, maybe The Old Man and the Sea.
Oh, Hemingway. Oh, yeah, brilliant book.
On the island. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd recommend that one as well. A very for those that are sort of into literature and fiction, maybe. How just an author skilled enough to write an entire novella about a guy trying to catch a fish. Yeah. Just sublime for the literature fans out there. Okay, next one, Tom. If you could take the reins of power at the Department of Health, what policy would you implement to improve the mental well-being of the general public?